Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Harris Pastides, president of our university. I'm dressed in happiness this evening. 'Tis the season to dress like this, but really I'm bursting with pride, and I'm happy to see so many of you here. What a wonderful turnout for a complex and very busy time of the year. We have scholars and colleagues from all over the, I said country, and Jennifer said from all over the world here. And of course, many, many faculty from our university and community members as well, all gathered to learn even more deeply something that I think we each believe to our core, that the humanities are important, but it's wonderful to learn even more about the value that they have. I will tell you that it's a point of concern to me and educators around the country that fewer students are majoring in the humanities, fewer than 10% now of all American college students. When I was in college in the 1970s, it was about 40%. You know, all of my friends seem to be either psychology or English or art history and biology, of course, and arts and sciences, and we went everywhere. We could do anything, and that, of course, is still the case today. That the best foundational knowledge for anybody wanting to be a productive member of our society and our workforce, of course, is a fundamental major in the arts, and I would add, or the sciences. And so many of our students triggered and promoted, I would say, by the outside world are saying major in a profession. And so they come to the University of South Carolina at age 17 or 18, and they immediately go into, now I don't want to offend anybody, but I'll say it, they immediately go into tourism or business or journalism, and those are great and valuable professions, but I always say, why not start in history or in English or in language or in math? And they say, well, what can I do with those? And I say everything, as opposed to anything and everything, as opposed to stovepiping yourself at the age of 17. Now, of course, in Europe, in France, for example, young people are stovepiped very early at that young age. In the lycée, for example, they are asked what they want to be when they grow up, and they're immediately tracked right away into law or medicine or physics or something like that. But we're beginning to lose that experimental quality of the freshman and sophomore year, where I tell them that is the time and college is the place for experimentation. Take many things, yes, even just because you enjoy them, or because you're curious, or because you've always heard about that, or have a friend who may have taken a great course and you would like to taste that as well. And then I say by junior year and then senior year, it is time to get focused. But it's hard. And I hope that this evening we're not preaching to the choir, if I may say. I plan to take the information that comes my way and improve the discourse I just gave. I hope you don't think I'm only saying these things to you. Many of our, most of us here, faculty, colleagues in the humanities, I say this at the Rotary, I say these things at the General Assembly, I say these things whenever people will listen, that the humanities allow us to reflect, they allow us to think deeply, they allow us to provide a humor or parody if we need to, like the ancient Greeks and the ancient Greek comedies that were not merely for entertainment, but were a reflection on the body politic at the time, and we need that now, I think we would agree, more than ever. And it's not just the entertainment side of it, but the true critical and criticism side of what the humanities can bring. Our son, Andrew, is an actor. Our daughter studied art history and then museum studies, and even though they still carry our ATM card, we love them. We love them. Don't tell them I said that, Patricia, please. They're very sensitive about that. And they are, they are great critics. They have great character. Not, I would say, only because they studied and majored in the humanities. I think, in fact, that's probably what drove them to those disciplines. Keen concern for the world, for making the world a better place. But I also don't want us to be isolated from the other wonderful disciplines at this university and everywhere, from engineering and from mathematics and from science. And law and medicine, they're absolutely vital to a university and to us. But if we're not careful, and by the way, thank heavens for the core curriculum. It is not only because it is the students who take through requirements the courses that many of you teach that we can keep the humanities afloat, but far more importantly because they get the foundation that we hope they will have in leadership and in culture and of course in all the disciplines that they study that they would need and would never get anywhere else. So we're contemplating an initiative, hopefully for next year. I don't want to. The problem with saying that is many of you will say, oh yeah, the arts as an initiative or the humanities as an initiative, and even that kind of begins to marginalize them. You know, we don't want that to be an initiative. We want the humanities to be woven and interwoven through the fabric of everything we do, in fact. But nevertheless, there are times in society like now where attention is being driven to every other domain, every other corner, other professional disciplines that we, I think, need an initiative that would be multicultural and multidisciplinary. And I see some of our faculty leaders who are working with me on that. So stay tuned and we will reach out to you for your input and engagement as well. So I welcome you here tonight. I'm extremely excited to hear the early part of our guest lecture. Patricia and I are hosting yet another festivity at the house, and so we may need to duck out a little bit later. But for now, I'd like to welcome our esteemed colleague who, by the way, and I hope we will learn more about the Templeton Foundation initiative and grant and about the colleagues who are here. So enjoy the holidays. Let's learn a lot tonight, be better informed, and come back. And maybe with all of us dedicating ourselves to the right things, the university and our nation will be a better place down the road. So welcome, everybody. Please welcome Jennifer Frey from the Department of Philosophy.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Pastides. I am continually grateful for your support of this research project, but also for the humanities. I know that just from speaking to many of my colleagues within academia, not everyone has such a supportive president. So I'm very grateful and I feel very lucky for that. I just want to begin by acknowledging our institutional partners for this event. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the John Templeton Foundation for making this event and this broader research project possible. The John Templeton Foundation's support of interdisciplinary research into the virtues has been extremely impactful in the field, and I know that I'm far from alone in being grateful to them for continuing to invest in this area of knowledge. Second, I would like to acknowledge the support of Chapel Wilson and the Phi Beta Kappa Society here at the University of South Carolina. I think she's over there. For those of you who may not be familiar with them, Phi Beta Kappa is a society dedicated to the preservation of academic freedom and the liberal arts. So it's fitting that they should be a part of this university-wide conversation, as I think they well understand and have a stake in the liberal arts, just as we do. Third, I would like to acknowledge the support of the Center for Value, Law, and Humanities here at USC. The center is doing important work here on campus, work that I'm honored to be a part of, to establish the nature of the value of the humanities and a plan to communicate that value to the broader university community. So thanks especially to Tony Jarrells and Holly Crocker in English, to Thomas Crocker in the law school, and to Justin Weinberg, who's my colleague in the philosophy department, for all the work you've done to found and sustain the center and to spread the word about this event. I'm really grateful. Finally, thanks to all of you for coming. I'm really overwhelmed at the turnout, especially this time of year. And welcome to everybody who's watching this live. I also just want to say a few practical remarks about this evening. After the lecture, there will be a question and answer session. So just raise your hand if you have a question for our speaker, but also please wait until a microphone is brought to you. I will have 2 assistants with handheld mics, so just keep your hands raised. You have to speak into the microphone, otherwise your question will not be picked up by the live stream feed. I also want to note that there is a reception in the lobby down the hall immediately after the talk. And so I would like to invite you and encourage you to come to the reception. There'll be lots to eat and drink. And finally, you'll notice that there are surveys on your chairs. So these surveys go back to the John Templeton Foundation. We would really appreciate your cooperation in filling them out. And you can just hand them in to Valerie Wallace, who is our communications director, and we would be very grateful for that. Okay, so now it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce our speaker, Professor Talbot Brewer. Tal Brewer is a professor of philosophy and the chair of the philosophy department at the University of Virginia. He's a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies, and he's a scholar in my research project, which is called Virtue, Happiness, and the Meaning of Life. Tal received his PhD in philosophy from Harvard University, where he has also been a visiting professor. He has been a research fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Practical Ethics and Public Life, and a graduate fellow at Harvard University's Edmund J. Safra Foundation Center for Ethics. He specializes in ethics and moral psychology, with particular attention to Aristotelian virtue ethics, which is my own line of work. He is the author of numerous essays, and in particular, he recently authored a book called The Retrieval of Ethics, which I think is really quite profound. So please join me in welcoming Professor Talbot Brewer.
Well, thank you so much, Jen. I want to thank the Virtue, Happiness, and the Meaning of Life program and the Templeton Foundation and the University of South Carolina for hosting me and putting on this event. Thanks to all of you for coming tonight. It's an honor for me to be here, and especially an honor to be asked to talk about such an important topic. I'm a philosopher by training, and for years I did my reading and my writing and my teaching without giving nearly enough thought to the question why anyone beyond my students and fellow philosophers should care about such activity or should wish them to take place in a public university. I was roused from that cocoon just over 4 years ago when the Board of Visitors of the University of Virginia, where I work, attempted to replace our president and remake the university in ways that appeared to me at least quite hostile to the humanities and more broadly to the ideal of a liberal arts education. Now, here in Columbia, it hasn't come to anything, as far as I know, quite as dramatic as the secretive sacking of a president, and let's hope it doesn't. You're very fortunate to have such an enlightened president. And I really appreciated I really appreciated President Pastides' remarks just a moment ago. They were wonderful and rarely heard from university professors. Still, political support for liberal arts education appears to be about as unreliable, or maybe even more unreliable here than in Virginia. With the quick research that I did through a couple of Google inquiries, I learned that in the past 8 years, South Carolina has reduced per capita spending on public higher education, that is the state of South Carolina, by around 40%, which is about twice as much as we've reduced it in Virginia, and more than all but 2 or 3 other states. I don't envy those whose task it is to argue in state capitals against this slow motion disinvestment in public higher education. The current political climate very nearly requires these arguments to be put in terms that strike me at least as deeply alien to the lived experience of the humanities. For instance, Florida Governor Rick Scott, I think, channels the prevailing outlook when he says, if I'm going to take money from a citizen and put it into education, then I'm going to take that money to create jobs. Is it a vital interest of the state to have more anthropologists? I don't think so. Here's North Carolina governor, for not much longer, Patrick McCrory. If you want to take gender studies, that's fine. Go to a private school and take it. But I don't want to subsidize that if it's not going to get someone a job. Okay, here's Governor Scott. Well, I don't have a quote from Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin, but he does seem to agree. He's slashed funding for the state university system, and he's vowed to direct any future allocations to those particular portions of the university that succeed in placing their graduates in high-paying jobs. Now, this basic picture of the public case for higher education, you might think is just embraced by a handful of Republicans, but in fact, we hear it echoed in the rhetoric of many prominent Democrats. It surfaces, for instance, in the speeches of President Obama, who has tied the justifiability of spending on all levels of education to economic competitiveness, and has praised Singapore and other Far Eastern nations for emphasizing science and technology, thereby, and this is a quote, spending less time teaching things that don't matter and more time teaching things that do. Well, I don't know where our president-elect stands on these matters, but if Trump University is any indication of what he thinks the university ought to be like, then I don't think that January 20th is going to make the political climate a lot more friendly for what we do. Given that that's how elected officials seem to think, it's not surprising that the Friends of Liberal Arts Education often frame their case in economic terms. Thus, the American Association of Colleges and Universities has claimed that liberal education is, quote, America's most valuable economic asset. And here in South Carolina, the State Commission on Higher Education has adopted a similar stance, arguing that investments in the supply of educated people reliably accelerate economic growth with a return on investment calculated at about $11 for each dollar spent. Now, as I just mentioned, this sort of argument doesn't resonate, at least for me, with the lived experience of the humanities and their value. But while the failings of the argument, these failings, concern me, I'm also concerned about the possibility that it might succeed too well. For if contributions to economic productivity really were used as a tool for determining which branches of the university should grow and which should wither, this, I think, would further displace the humanities from their traditional position at the core of the university, while bolstering those programs whose offerings more closely resemble vocational training. Now, I think there are similar difficulties with the second most influential argument for the conclusion that the public should fund the humanities. That's the argument that the humanities deserve funding because they're vital to the healthy functioning of democratic institutions. While there's surely something to this argument, as to the economic argument, both have only a limited reach. Look, if one wants to encourage youth to engage in politics in a respectful and mutually comprehending spirit, it might help to have them read John Locke's Second Treatise and study the Federalist Papers, but it's not clear that it's really necessary to have them read Madame Bovary or To the Lighthouse or The Brothers Karamazov or Remembrance of Things Past, or to have them study Aboriginal sculpture, Renaissance painting, or Baroque music, or to ask them to wrestle their way through Kant's First Critique or Aristotle's Metaphysics or Kierkegaard's Either Or. Here again, what worries me about the argument is that it might succeed too well, for its consistent application would be, I think, the undoing of much of what we know and value under the heading of the humanities. Speaking personally, I think I have something especially valuable to offer to those students who are not gripped by whatever satisfactions may be available in the cubicle of a Fortune 500 corporation or in politics is currently practiced, and to tie the worth of what I do to my role in preparing young minds for these pursuits would be to betray the impulse that drew me to this profession and to turn my back on the bond I've established with those students that I feel I might perhaps have really reached. So I feel a pressing need to articulate a different sort of argument for the humanities. But how's that to be done? What good are the humanities? Well, that's our question today. And we won't get very far with it unless we ask a prior question, that is, what exactly are the humanities? I don't mean to ask here for a list of the academic disciplines, standardly grouped together under this heading. I mean to ask what these disciplines have in common, such that this grouping is not a mere bureaucratic habit or historic accident. Now, I think it might help to begin with the first thing that college students notice about the difference between the humanities and the social and natural sciences when they arrive on campus. That's something they notice when they go to the bookstore before classes have even started. They're likely to find that for their humanities classes, they need to buy a rather substantial stack of books, maybe 8 or 10 dog-eared volumes, many of them by long-dead authors. And when they go to purchase the books for their natural and social science classes, they're much more likely to buy 1 or 2 books, usually very new books, usually hefty textbooks. And those books are either by authors who are living or, they're usually by authors who are living or teams of authors who are living, and very often they're updated every couple of years to sort of stay abreast of the field. So what does that simple observation, available to students before they even set foot or sit down in a humanities or social or natural science classroom, tell us about the difference between the humanities and other disciplines? Well, it tells us that in other disciplines, there's a conviction among competent practitioners that the key inquiries, findings, and texts that have shaped the history of the discipline can be mined for the insights that are worth passing on to students now. Those insights can be extracted, so to speak, summarized in textbooks and passed on in that summary form. It seems that that humanities professors, given the widespread view that textbooks are not the best way to pass on whatever we do in the humanities to students, don't think that this is possible. That is, they think that to engage beneficially in whatever it is that we do in the humanities, you need to you need to throw yourself into the texts that have been formative for these fields. It's engagement with the texts themselves that sort of draws you into the activity of the humanities. So there's a difference. And what I want to do is to try to contextualize and sort of mine that difference and think about what's going on there. So let me mention a second closely related difference, which is that the humanities seem to grow out of and shed light on life experiences or perplexities that can be presumed to be quite general among human beings. To begin again with my field and with its beginnings, Socrates finds openings to philosophical conversation in the everyday thoughts of his fellow Athenians, thoughts that they're bound to have if they're to make sense of the world and their lives. He sort of wanders the streets of Athens, buttonholing his fellow citizens, and whatever they happen to be thinking about is seized upon by him as the beginning of a philosophical conversation. That is, he thinks of philosophical conversation as growing out of and giving refinement to everyday life concerns. It's, I think, very similar in the case, something similar can be said in the case of novels and plays and poems. They're all open to ordinary life. It's our experience of life, our curiosity about what it holds and how it can go that draws us into the humanities. They don't seem to be a specialized or adventitious human pursuit suitable for a team of specialists. They seem instead to be the intensification and refinement of a task that falls upon all human beings. I might put it this way, the task of making sense of human life from the participant perspective. the perspective of somebody who must lead a life and therefore must adopt a stance toward what it makes sense for human beings to do or to be. Reflecting from this perspective has a couple of further implications that are worth noting, it seems to me. First, when one is reflecting in this way, one's task is not primarily descriptive, but rather self-formative. The self doesn't remain still while it brings its own commitments and intuitions into view. It comes into view by giving itself a more determinate form, either through the clarification of its own inchoate ideas or through the creative expression of its inchoate visions. And when one strives for clarity about the task of leading a human life, one's perspective will be irreducibly and unapologetically human. Unlike the sciences, the humanities do not aspire to a set of findings or data points that should be affirmed by any kind of intelligent creature, no matter its perceptual apparatus or emotional makeup or longings or typical relationships or characteristic path from birth to death. On the contrary, the humanities arise from engagement with these and other peculiarities of human life, and at their best, they lend depth and meaning to our experience of these peculiarities. Now, because humanistic reflection begins from and refines one's first personal perspective, one can't so much as get started in humanistic inquiry without formulating one's own initial views, which I think is one reason why MOOCs are not an ideal model for humanities teaching. Now, this requirement is dramatized in the Platonic dialogues, where the identity of the first Western academic institution was being hammered out, that is Plato's Academy. The sole rule that Plato has Socrates insist upon is say what you really think. If you don't do that, then your thoughts, what you really believe, none of that's in play. That is, it's not available for assessment or refinement. Humanistic dialogue must begin where you are, with your thoughts, precisely because it's a self-formative pursuit. And because it begins with what you think and moves forward only if and when the discussion leads your evolving thoughts to a new and different place, such inquiry has a distinctive phenomenology. Progress comes not by having conferred upon you a set of facts or by mastering some domain of information, but rather by the dawning of a kind of a recognition, a first personal recognition. The teacher in the Socratic view plays the role not of authoritative expert, but of midwife. That's Socrates' word for it, helping the thoughts of others to be born. Now, it's not just the teacher understood in the narrow sense who plays the role of midwife in humanities classes. It's also that stack of old books we mentioned a moment ago. Here's how Emerson puts it. In every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty. I think that that's beautifully put. It seems like one of my rejected thoughts. And those kinds of retrieved thoughts are the stuff of the humanities, the instruments of its self-formative practice. Think here of what metaphors can do to our view of the world. A good metaphor opens up a new, fresh, and unanticipated way of seeing something. But it also has to be something the aptness of which we ourselves can recognize. Certifying a metaphor as a good one is something that we do by having its aptness dawn on us, not by consulting an expert. We ourselves recognize the insightful views of human life that we find in authors like Proust or James or Shakespeare. They help us to bring to clarity what's already implicit in our life experience, even if it's at the very horizon of visibility. And they would be lesser writers if they didn't do this. But things are quite otherwise in the sciences. We typically don't recognize our own rejected thoughts, our own inchoate thoughts, when we first encounter such ideas as heliocentrism, or evolution, or relativity, or quantum entanglement. On the contrary, we are brutally surprised by these things. I've been focusing on encounters with written texts, but I think that very similar claims hold good for the visual and performing arts. Here, too, the work of creation requires a recognitional capacity that's also exercised when we appreciate what has been created. While it's true that the creator actively uncovers the valuable possibilities brought into reality in the work, still, a good audience will have a critical sense of the artwork's shortcomings or unrealized potentialities. And this sense of what might have made the work better is just the sort of sense, just the sort of intuitive apprehension that guides the artist. The humanities, then, involve moments of creative or intellectual expression and moments of critical reflection that assess and refine these expressions, but these activities are not really distinct. They're different phases or aspects of the work, in some cases the collective work of self-development. Now, the term humanities can be traced to the Latin humanitas, which was pressed into use by Cicero and others to inherit the Greek notion of paideia. These predecessor notions, these predecessor terms, picked out an educational ideal intended to bring the human type to its full and proper development. This contrasts with the currently ascendant notion that the humanities are a distinctive area of study, distinguished from other areas of study within the university by the fact that they have a particular subject matter different from the other areas. If you look at the Wikipedia entry for humanities, what you'll see is that they're said to be the study of human culture. It also contrasts with the idea that all academic disciplines, including the humanities and the social and natural sciences, are united by their common pursuit of information. That's an idea put forward recently by Steven Pinker in a New Republic essay, which has many wonderful moments and is, makes an argument that by and large I agree with, which is that the sciences are not by any means the enemy of the humanities. I completely accept that background point, but I think that he mischaracterizes the commonality between the humanities and the sciences by taking all of them to be in quest of information. The humanities are not a mere area of study, as is witnessed by the inclusion within the humanities of drawing, acting, sculpting, photography, painting, philosophizing, and the writing of fiction, poetry, and plays. Nor are they oriented towards the accumulation of information. They take their identity from an aspirational ideal of human self-development that centers on disciplined thought and creative self-expression, and that honors the sort of critical discussion that prepares the way for new stretches of thought and new stretches of creative self-expression. I said a moment ago that before addressing the question what good the humanities are, we should try to get clear on the question what the humanities are. But I hope you'll begin to see that these two questions really aren't distinct. The second question is the crucial one. Once we see what the humanities are, the value of the humanities should speak for itself. Or, at least, to quote Louis Armstrong, if you still have to ask, you're never going to know. Right? These two questions end up collapsing into one because the humanities take their very identity from a sweeping vision of how life ideally should go. A vision that emphasizes expressive nuance and articulacy and reflective self-formation. The defining good of the humanities is to be sought here in the vision of human growth and development that gives us a sense of what the humanities in the first place are, and not primarily in their contributions to economic productivity or political life. That's not to say that courses in the humanities contribute nothing to economic productivity or nothing to democratic self-rule. I think they can contribute quite a lot to both. It's only to say that they would be badly deformed by any attempt to reshape them so as to produce these incidental goods more efficiently, and also it's to say that we haven't plumbed the depths of the real value of the humanities if that's all we see. Now, while I've been developing the idea of the humanities partly by way of contrast with the sciences, I have no wish whatsoever to revive the pointless antagonisms of the Snow-Levis two cultures debates. We should happily affirm the possibility, and indeed the desirability, of pursuing the natural and social sciences under a more inclusive picture of how we are to live, namely in light of an understanding of our kind, its psychology, its social forms and habits, its origins, and its place in the cosmos. Fortunately, this inclusive educational ideal already has a name. It's called liberal arts education. Resistance to the humanities arises not from that ideal, but from a different picture of education, one that may be as corrosive to the integral practice of science as to the humanities. Now, I wouldn't be giving this talk if the humanities were not in serious trouble on campuses around the country. So I want to look now at two aspects of the background culture that help to explain the demise of the humanities, and that I think lend special urgency to the effort to resuscitate them. The first concerns the consumption side of the economic order, and in particular, the manufacture of consumer desire. The second concerns the production side of the economic order, and in particular, the regimentation of the workplace. Tackling these large themes in the small time allotted here tonight will require me to make some reckless and sweeping claims. Anyway, I specialize in them, so don't worry about that. So I'm going to jump right in with the reckless and sweeping claim that in the industrialized West, the basic cultural dynamics of the 20th and early 21st centuries have taken a reverse Weberian form, and that this has turned the economy itself into a potent instrument of lifelong education, one whose teachings are fundamentally hostile to the humanities. Let me explain what I mean. Weber traced the rise of industrial capitalism to the combination, within Calvinist and Pietist sects of Christianity, of a call to zealous pursuit of a secular vocation and a strict asceticism that ruled out worldly luxuries. This combination favored savings, accumulation of capital, and reinvestment of that capital in new enterprises. And this, according to Weber, is essential to the early historical phase of capitalism. But the asceticism and thrift that propel early capital accumulation eventually become a threat to the economy that they spawn. In Western Europe and North America, the tipping point seems to have been reached sometime around 1890 or 1900. By that time, productivity had increased to the point where it posed a serious threat of glut-driven crisis. Averting this crisis required the production of an immaterial good, one that couldn't be grown in a field or made in a factory, required the mass production of consumer desire. And for the past century, the background social conditions and communication technologies have been in place to permit this requirement to be met with ever-increasing success. The old-fashioned virtue of thrift has slowly been replaced by habits of debt and consumption that would once have struck people as, very seriously bad and as idolatrous. Public acceptance of these erstwhile sins has progressed to the point where their unabashed standard bearer, the self-proclaimed king of debt, whose name is synonymous with opulence, is now, and I still find this hard to say, our president-elect. So I call this dynamic reverse Weberian, not merely because it so perfectly reverses the content of the Calvinist frugality that Weber regarded as the motor of capitalism, but also because it reverses the form of Weberian historical explanation. Economic processes are now causing fundamental changes in prevailing values, not the other way around. From the beginning, it was evident that the crucial resource needed for this reformation of values was human attention. As Emily Fogg Mead, mother of Margaret Mead, explained in an influential turn-of-the-century essay on marketing techniques, the successful advertisement is obtrusive. It continually forces itself upon the attention. It may be on signboards, in the streetcar, or on the page of a magazine. Everyone reads it involuntarily. It is a subtle, persistent, unavoidable presence that creeps into the reader's inner consciousness. Now, Mead speaks of attention here. I think it's clear that this has become an exceedingly valuable and increasingly contested commodity. And also, I think from the economic point of view, a strange one, in that its owner would often prefer not to sell it and is rarely the one who pockets the proceeds from the sale. It's worth taking a moment to reflect on just how vital a resource attention is. It's the medium of passion, of friendship, of love. It's the sign of our presence to one another, both in intimate spaces and in public. It's the antidote to listlessness and heedlessness, the conferrer of reality upon the deeds of children and entertainers and narcissistic politicians. And it's the prerequisite for any concerted activity, including the activities of reading, viewing, critical thinking, writing, and intensive conversational exchange that are central to the liberal arts. Now, attention has these enormous powers because it serves as the portal to thinking and to creative imagining. No course of activity can so much as suggest itself to us unless our attention is structured by some awareness of its possibility, and no activity fully worthy of a human being can blossom unless it's carried forward and completed by avid attention to the valuable possibilities latent in it. It's because of this intimate connection to thought and action that attention is so coveted by those who seek power and wealth, and it's because valuable activities such as the practice of the humanities must wholly absorb our attention that there is an inherent conflict between our interest in excelling in such activities and the ambitions of those who seek wealth and power, at least in certain communicative climates. That conflict is maybe always in the background, but its severity is acutely sensitive to changes in the technological means for intruding upon the attention of others. The magazine ads and signboards that so alarmed Emily Fogg Mead appear in retrospect to be quaintly inefficient means of claiming attention. They've long since ceded their role to the various electronic screens to which we devote so great a share of our daily attention. This change in medium has made possible a dramatic increase in the obtrusiveness and effectiveness of the consumerist mode of soul formation, hence a dramatic magnification of the obstacle that it poses to human flourishing generally, and maybe to the humanities particularly. American children between the ages of 2 and 11 see an average of 25,000 commercial messages per year, or 68 per day, which is to say about 4 per waking hour of life on television alone. That's not to mention the many messages that arrive via those other ubiquitous black mirrors, our cell phones and computers. Now, I think it's safe to say that no human civilization has ever invested so much of its wealth, so much effort, and so much ingenuity in imprinting upon future generations an evaluative outlook that most of its adult members view with deep suspicion. It used to be that only marginalized cultural minorities felt themselves obliged to protect their children from the socializing influence of mainstream culture. In our country, this has been the plight of the Amish, of the Hasidim, and of other minoritarian faith communities. But these days, we're all Amish, at least in the sense that it has become a majoritarian quest to try to protect one's children from the best funded instruments of collective socialization. And for the most part, we fail in this quest. Now, if we consider education in the widest sense, this unprecedented, rather bizarre mode of acculturation must surely be counted as a de facto form of privately funded education. Matriculation occurs at a very early age, and most kids have impressive powers of brand recognition and develop brand preferences and initial sense of the meaning of various corporate symbols before they learn to read. And by the time they find their way to our classrooms, our students have already benefited from 18 years of this subsidized schooling, and it's left deep traces on their intuitive sense of what to expect from human communication, their sense, that is, of what words and images are for. We've devised a world in which mercenary words and images continually press upon us. Wherever our eyes are likely to alight, someone is willing to pay for images and text that they can alight upon. They elbow us, it seems to me, out of the quiet mental repose that contemplation requires. They cultivate the implicit understanding that it's the job of the communicator to win our attention and hold it fast, and that the normal and fitting way to apportion one's attention is in quick bursts of passive fixation. When amid this clamor of manipulative messages, there suddenly appears something quite different, something called literature or art or philosophy. It's not easy to open ourselves to this newcomer. Our environment has not encouraged the traits required for properly appreciative engagement. the habit of devoted attention, and of patience and generosity in interpretation, the openness to finding camaraderie and illumination from others in the more treacherous passages of human life, the expressive conscience that insists upon finding exactly the right words for incipient thoughts. Now, what degrades our attentional habits, not just advertising, certainly, but it's continual exposure to those communicative forms that survive the fierce that are selected for by the fierce competition for advertising dollars. Advertisers, quite understandably, prefer those settings, or as sometimes they're called, attention brokers, that deliver up as many eyeballs as possible, but also that deliver them up in as uncritical and therefore suggestible a mood as possible. Competition for advertising dollars, then, will tend to support those communicative platforms that encourage prolonged and fascinated wandering through mazes of words and images. That's the sort of intentional environment that I think we fashion for ourselves, the sort that we awake from hours after entering, not quite sure how we were detained for so long or what exactly we've been doing. And this environment could hardly be less conducive to the concerted, self-formative reflection that enlivens the humanities. Now, I've been tracing the consequences of a sweeping historical thesis about the consumption side of late capitalism. I want now to consider another equally reckless and sweeping thesis about the production side. The thesis is that the growth of productivity during the 20th and early 21st centuries have been achieved at an extraordinarily high human cost, a cost that's now beginning to visit the academic workplace, but that these same increases in productivity have opened the unprecedented possibility of a genuinely democratic, non-elitist practice of liberal education. I'll begin elaborating this second sweeping and reckless thesis with a brief look at the ideas of Frederick Winslow Taylor, a man who has arguably done more to shape our daily lives than any other American thinker. Taylor is best known for a potent little book called The Principles of Scientific Management, which appeared in 1911, just a few years after Emily Fogg Mead published her worries about advertising. Taylor's professed aim was, quote, the development of each man to his state of maximal efficiency so that he may be able to do, generally speaking, the highest grade work for which his natural abilities fit him. In truth, I think Taylorism consisted in appropriation by management of the practical knowledge of skilled workers so that formerly high-skilled production processes could be decomposed into simple bodily motions that required relatively little skill and could be repeated on assembly lines at great speed. The deskilling of the workforce greatly reduced the bargaining leverage of each worker by making each worker much more replaceable, making it possible to hold them to the discipline of the stopwatch as a condition of further employment. And Taylor used his stopwatch ruthlessly. With that stopwatch, timing different bodily motions, he was able to stamp out those hiccups in industrial production that emanate from the workers' distinctively human faculties, whether daydreaming or playfulness or a taste for autonomous self-direction or any of those micro-subversions of workplace discipline, those petty thefts of time that the French call la perruque. I think they use that word in an admiring tone. Given how favorable the Taylorist dispensation is to employers, it's perhaps not surprising that workplaces around the planet have been reorganized in its terms. What's more surprising is the moralism that helped to propel its rise. While the French may see a certain dignity, or at least an admirable insouciance, in petty thefts of time, Americans tend to see nothing but laziness and irresponsibility, a failure to pull one's weight. The manager, understood as expert in organizational efficiency and productivity, is thus often seen on these shores as the bearer of a moral mandate, a duty, to quote Taylor, to mold competent men and thereby to move us along, quote, the road to national efficiency. Nor did Taylor think of the manager's expertise as limited to the regimentation of factory and labor. Like many contemporary management experts, Taylor claimed that the science of management, quote, can be applied with equal force to all social activities, to the management of our homes, the management of our farms, the management of the business of the tradesman, large and small, of our churches, our philanthropic institutions, our universities, and our government departments. Now, that managerial techniques can be applied to these varied activities is no doubt true. Yet, like the crafts before them, so too these activities usually have to be disfigured in order to be made manageable. So there's much to object to in Taylor's claim. Yet considered as a prediction, or better as a warning, a kind of shot across the bows, his words have proven quite apt. To take the case that concerns us perhaps most directly, at least those of us who work in universities, between 1975 and 2005, American college and university faculties grew by 51%, which is to say, almost but not quite enough to keep pace with increases in incoming students. During the same interval, the ranks of administrators and non-faculty professionals nearly tripled. That is, they grew 4 times as fast as student enrollment. Meanwhile, at many colleges and universities, including my own, representation of business persons on governing boards has increased markedly, bringing to campus the ethos of the business enterprise and its quest for productivity enhancement. During my time as chair of the UVA philosophy department, which is to say the last 6 years, we've managed to fend off what I've already mentioned, the attempted sacking of the university president for her supposed lack of entrepreneurial acumen. We've also fended off a bid launched by the same board of visitors that tried to get rid of our president to apportion faculty raises to numerical research impact scores provided by the private consulting company Academic Analytics. However, we have grudgingly accepted the demand to devise numerical measures of the effectiveness of our graduate and undergraduate programs. For the moment, it's up to us what we measure and graph. This is all quite new. And we do our best to devise measures that are not wholly irrelevant to our calling. But I suspect that soon an enterprising official at our regional accrediting agency, which is the entity that, as far as I can tell, is behind this demand, will see that these measures are of relatively little value. Then, instead of drawing the correct conclusion that the production of prescribed and measurable results is not the business of a humanities department, this official may well conclude that academic departments can't be entrusted with the task of evaluating themselves, and that accreditation should henceforth require standardized assessments so that colleges and universities can be compared with one another. While academic departments might then be made to excel in the efficient production of some publicly certifiable outcome, they'll become even less hospitable to the humanities. Now, our work would have straightforwardly measurable outcomes if it were oriented towards the enhancement of job skills or the securing of highly paid jobs. It would then make sense to conduct quantitative assessments and to alter our practices in their light. We would, of course, no longer be practitioners of the liberal arts, but someone, say the current governor of Florida or North Carolina or Wisconsin, might say that we would then, at long last, be doing our part to fulfill that duty proclaimed by Taylor, the duty to enhance national productivity. Now, I feel very strongly that we have no such duty, and I'm going to try to explain why. In 1930, after 20 years of Taylorist enhancements in factory productivity, John Maynard Keynes published a little essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. Keynes projected, quite correctly, that increased worker productivity would soon make it possible to sustain a decent standard of living for all while reducing the average work week to 15 hours per week. This would, he thought, bring human beings face to face with what he termed our real and permanent problem. What's that? What to do with our lives once we no longer have to expend almost all of our waking hours in meeting basic human needs. Interestingly, the liberal arts originated as a self-conscious attempt to resolve that very problem. They originally took their identity from a contrast with the servile arts, which is to say, the arts needed for efficiently navigating the condition of captivity to basic need. The liberal arts originated as an answer to the question how we should manage, how it would be best to manage liberty from the compulsion of basic need. Now, Keynes was deeply pessimistic about the human capacity to cultivate the arts of liberty. And indeed, we seem inclined to evade our permanent problem, even in conditions of remarkable prosperity. As sociologist Juliet Schor observes, the material consumption rates achieved in 1948 could have been sustained in the 1990s, even if every single worker took every other year entirely off. Yet the average American family contributed 16 more weeks of full-time work to the formal economy in 1988 than in 1967. It's not just a reflection of the entry of more family members into the workforce. The trend holds good at the individual level as well as the family level. The average U.S. worker put in 148 more hours per year in 1996 than in 1973. Nor does this seem to be a function of economic need. The percentage of U.S. workers putting in more than 49 hours per week grew from 13% in 1976 to 19% in 1998, while the percentage of managers working that many hours grew from 40 to 45%. This is the flip side of the vast increase in consumption that we've experienced in recent decades. We're working more and we're spending more, not now in the name of mere survival or basic creature comforts, but as our de facto answer to what Keynes called the permanent question of humankind. I'm convinced this is not a good answer from the point of view of human flourishing. More pointedly, it can't possibly be the answer for all of humankind. We could increase the consumption levels of the world's entire population to the levels currently prevailing in the US and Western Europe if one thing were to happen. That one thing would be getting our hands on 5 more planets with roughly the same natural endowments as the one that we now have. So we have to rethink our current answer in a vastly less production and consumption-oriented direction. But in a sense, this problem of greatly excessive productive capacities is a beautiful problem to have, for what it means is that, for the first time in human history, we can foster the arts of liberty, understood in the sense I just mentioned, including the humanities, as a widespread, non-elitist human practice. I realize that this vision sounds quite radical, but we face problems today that absolutely require radical changes in our habits of getting and spending. If we choose among the possible futures that currently seem politically realistic, we'll do untold damage to future generations. We would also, I think, do wrong by our contemporaries, since our social compact for the distribution of productive work and buying power is rapidly coming apart at the seams. The most recent presidential election seems to have been decided by the roiling discontent of those who've been left without access to decently paid work, partly by the offshoring of factories, but also in large part by growth in automation. President Obama's post-election observations on this situation are worth pondering. What Obama said is that the long-term solution lies neither in Trump-style protectionism nor in coaxing another spurt of economic growth from the global economy. For, now here quoting from Obama, when the problem is not just Uber, but driverless Uber, which just hit its second city yesterday, I think, San Francisco, when radiologists are losing their jobs to artificial intelligence, then we're going to have to figure out how do we maintain a cohesive society and a cohesive democracy in which productivity and wealth generation are not automatically linked to how many hours you put in. That is, we're going to have to figure out how to make it possible for people to meet their material needs when an amply productive economy no longer requires their full-time employment. This is just another facet of what Keynes called the permanent problem of humankind, how to manage our gradual, step-by-step emancipation from the overwhelming, all-day, everyday demands of material need. Obama is quite right, I think, that this problem is upon us. What I've suggested is that one essential part of the solution is a reinvigoration of the liberal arts as traditionally conceived, that is, conceived as a preparation for just this kind of liberty. If we take the long view, then, it strikes me as a fool's errand to spend our resources fashioning our youths into maximally productive economic commodities. It would be far better to provide them with the encouragement and education needed to become deep and well-rounded human beings. The benefits won't show up on the metric of return on investment, but that shouldn't be the measure of the human future on this planet. Now, I've been speaking about the value of the humanities and about the threats they face, but I haven't directly addressed one crucial question. That is the question why the humanities deserve public support. Some commentators, including most prominently Martha Nussbaum, have claimed that arguments like mine, which locate the value of the humanities and their contribution to a good human life, are inadmissible in the public sphere. As Nussbaum sees it, modern democracies, quote, are societies in which the meaning and ultimate goals of human life are topics of reasonable disagreement among citizens who hold many different religious and secular views. And these citizens will naturally differ about how far various types of humanistic education serve their own particular goals. This inclines her to argue for the humanities solely in terms of their contribution to democratic self-rule, which she takes to be a value that cuts across these disagreements. Now, I think Nussbaum is mistaken to insist upon strict neutrality or strict neutralitarian limits on state concern with the acculturation of new citizens. This sort of neutrality effectively cedes the task of shaping future citizens to the highest bidders, namely corporations in their capacity as advertisers and as communicative platform shapers, which is just what has made the background culture so deeply inhospitable to the humanities. Against the backdrop of today's communications technology, and especially in the context of what is less a democracy than a corporatocracy, neutralitarianism has the non-neutral effect of promoting a consumerist and careerist monoculture, something that the liberal lover of plural experiments in living ought to denounce unequivocally. So I think that Nussbaum's argument turns on a mistaken picture of the proprieties of public deliberation, one whose real-world effects are illiberal and baleful and especially bad for the humanities. But still, even if I've succeeded in my decidedly non-neutral effort to show that the humanities are good for each of us, that alone doesn't constitute a case for public support. I mean, massages are good for all of us too, but that doesn't mean they should be provided on the public dime. It's generally accepted that in addition to being good for people in general, public goods must meet two further criteria, two further tests. They must be non-excludable, that is, people cannot justly be kept from benefiting from other people's private investments in them. Massages fail that test. And they must be non-rivalrous. That is, one citizen's enjoyment of the good in question must not leave others with the short end of the stick. These criteria can help to explain why clean air, for instance, is a paradigmatic public good. It's non-excludable, because you really can't keep people from breathing, and it's non-rivalrous, because if I breathe, there's plenty of air left for all of you. Well, it's easy to see how economic and political arguments for the humanities meet the non-excludability condition. Economic productivity and just democratic institutions are obviously non-excludable goods. I mean, they may also bring some excludable goods with them, but that's another matter. My approach requires us to focus on those less tangible goods that we secure by leading our lives in the midst of a thoughtful and well-educated society. In such a society, we're able to converse and write and create at the edge of our own artistic and intellectual capacities with the realistic hope of being met with comprehension. It's important that you notice that I included converse in that list of things we can do, because I want this to be not a highfalutin, restricted activity that I'm describing, but an everyday activity. We're able to apprehend wisdom or inspiration in the words and creative expressions of others, and to be drawn towards greater depth or articulacy or sophistication by what we've seen and heard. For we help each other to bring into articulacy what we vaguely intuit but do not yet comprehend. Put another way, we help each other to grow into our own as human beings. And how far and how well we can grow is to a great degree determined by the creative and intellectual powers of that wide circle of human beings with whom we interact each day. The basic dynamic of this mutual dependence is well illustrated by a little anecdote that I just ran across in a portrait of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky that David Brooks published in the New York Times. He quotes Kahneman as follows. And they're lifelong intellectual partners who have won a Nobel Prize, right, together and done really amazing work in psychology, but also work that matters for my field, which includes an interest in rational decision theory and so forth. So here's Kahneman. The way the creative process works is that you first say something, and later, sometimes years later, you understand what you said. And in our case, it was foreshortened. I'd say something, and Amos understood it. It still gives me goosebumps. Well, the role played here by Amos is, I think, the role of Socratic midwifery. That is, helping others to give birth to the dimly apprehended thoughts on the far horizon of their mental vision. In an educated population, almost anyone might play the role of midwife to your half-articulated thoughts and you to theirs. And this can help to deepen and refine your engagement in the daily task of discerning the story of your life. As, something that is of great interest to Dan McAdams, my colleague in the program that we're all part of here in South Carolina. It can help you, I mean, that kind of midwifery can help you to excel in the daily task of discerning the story of your life. That is, imagining what that life story might make possible for you now and describing those possibilities in a language that brings their value vividly before your mind and makes clear what concretely you would need to do in order to realize that value. For we humans have art and we have philosophy because the leading of a life is already an incipiently artistic and philosophical undertaking. That's why we need to be in the midst of good muses and good midwives in order to rise to the task of leading a fully human life. Thoughts differ from typical saleable goods in that those who share them still possess them, and indeed may find their thoughts deepened and amplified by the exchange. For this reason, thoughts naturally lend themselves to gift economies rather than economies of market exchange. And it's characteristic of a healthy gift economy, including the gift economy of thought, to produce virtuous cycles of self-augmentation. When someone helps you to see further, this permits you to help others to see further as well. I think that's why what we call genius tends to occur in geographic clusters, such as occurred in the golden age of ancient Athens or in mid-18th century Edinburgh, to take a couple of examples. But gift economies are also subject to vicious cycles of self-diminution. This happens when the scheme of mutual exchange serves back a self-diminishing picture of nascent thoughts, one that pushes them toward superficiality rather than lifting them toward the heights. If our attention is fractured, if we limit the elaboration of our thoughts to 144 characters, if our typical response to the words and significant images of others is phrased in the language of likes and laughs out loud, then we'll be poor midwives to each other's emerging selves. Such a vicious cycle would leave us all badly impoverished, though again, not in ways that would show up in the measures of educational success favored by Governors Scott and McCrory and Walker. My hope is that by cultivating the liberal arts and the humanities among them, we might avoid such impoverishment, feeding a virtuous cycle that could help us to navigate what Keynes called the permanent problem of humankind. But I fear that we will instead sacrifice our already frayed cultural inheritance to the maw of economic productivity, leaving future generations with a pillaged natural environment and a badly degraded circle of cultural inheritances. Well, that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Christian Anderson, College of Education here. I think it's interesting that the question you started out by posing about is higher education to help someone prepare for a profession or for a good life, to get a job, or for these other pursuits, is something that goes back to the early days of American higher education. In the turn of the 19th century, we started to see the beginning of engineering schools and professional schools. And folks at Yale University, under the direction of Jeremiah Day, the president, came up with this report in defense of the classical curriculum, now known as the Yale Report of 1828, where they said the liberal arts and the classical curriculum should be our approach because it prepares the furniture of the mind. And then later on, you can figure out how to be a merchant, businessman, or whatever else. So it seems like we've been struggling with this forever. I don't know exactly how to pose this question, but is there, I don't think any new Yale Report of 1828 or even another talk like this is on its own going to steer towards some of this that you're arguing for. What in a bigger sense is going to get us to what you ended on, which is that question of how do we make this a public good?
Well, I think you're right that it's a long-standing struggle, and if we're lucky, it will continue to be a struggle. I think that would mean that somebody's still fighting the fight, right? But I do think that the stakes that the historic context has shifted, and that the kinds of threats that we're under are a little bit more alarming than they have been in the past, and that's why I tried to focus on the effects on the human psyche of our modes of getting and spending and communicating. And of course there's an interaction effect between whether one can engage in the activities that are central to the humanities, and also whether one can engage in those activities extremely well in a healthy, maintaining a sort of a healthy community of practitioners in this or that background cultural context. And it seems to me that the surrounding cultural context has become less hospitable. On the other hand, I tried to emphasize that certain possibilities have opened up for us that were not available in the past, and that are quite exciting. I emphasized the great increase in our productive capacities and the need to reorganize assignments within our productive enterprises, and the possibility of organizing them in a more egalitarian direction, which would, I think, open up the possibility of scholarly leisure time and genuine engagement in various intrinsically valuable human concerns for a much wider circle of people. Another sort of hopeful prospect that is brought on by our moment in history is that communicative platforms are available to us, which, if properly structured, could be enormously beneficial to the kind of self-augmenting gift economy that I briefly described at the end of the talk. You see some of that already in the enormous, generous sharing of thoughts and of reflections and visual imagery and so on and so forth that one can find in the most uplifting portions of that vast world we call the internet. Right? But I am worried about the way that the communicative platforms are being sculpted, and hence worried about the way that the future of the internet is being shaped. And I think that the elements of the internet that would lend themselves to sort of enlivening the kind of gift economy of thought that I briefly outlined are not quite as endangered as humanities on campuses, but almost that endangered. And so I think that it's characteristic of perfectionist practices like the activities that are central to the humanities that they're vulnerable to their surroundings and to their to whatever institutions they take place in, and to corruptions arising from that institutional setting, and even from their practitioners, right? The yoga industrial complex needs saving from, the yoga needs saving from the yoga industrial complex, and religion needs saving from whatever church it may be. So this is a perennial human problem, but I'm trying to focus on the particular intensifications of the problem that I think we see in our case, and I wish I could say something hopeful, outline something that would put an end to the battle, but I can't imagine what that would be. Yes, please.
I don't have a mic, I'll just talk loudly.
Okay.
All right. How should we use technology in a way that is going to be favorable to reversing the decline of the humanities? You've expressed some potential doubts or some dangers to technology as it currently is. How should we be developing it to stem that decline, and then how should we be using it as it is?
Yeah. Oh my Lord. Yeah. I wish I knew. I don't feel myself capable of describing a platform for communication, a technological framework for communication that would be ideally good for the kind of exchange that it seems to me that that's a question for others who specialize in, who are more versed in what's possible and so forth. But what I will say is that, look, communicative platforms embed philosophies of expression and communication, and you see communication shaped by the picture of communicative success that they embed. Some homely examples are the palette of reactions that are available on Facebook for postings there. I think it used to be that your only choice was like, but isn't it true that I don't really do Facebook, but I read that over the past year, a number of new responses were added to the reactions function, right? And I think they include love, like, haha. What are the others? Wow, and is there another? Angry and sad, right? I think those are your choices. And so if we're trying to cultivate, look, I realize that you can also comment at length, and that's a different matter, but possibly a productive one. Though there is a kind of a spirit of politesse or something like that, and superficiality that I think for the most part reigns in those commentaries, that isn't really the sort of thing that I have in mind. But that's a little example of how a technology suggests a form of communication. Another is I just got the new model of iPhone, or the updated operating system, or whatever it may be, that suggests emojis as you're typing in texts. And I noticed that the emoji that is suggested when I type happy is the same emoji that's suggested when I type good, right? And it strikes me that that's an interesting embedding of a picture of what it is for something of normative language, right? That we philosophers would call it a projectivist picture, right? To call something good is to express contentment with it, right? It's not to find a property in it. Well, if you embed that picture of what's going on in communication and structure sort of half symbolic and half verbal quick messages to your friends in a way that is sort of grounded in that picture, then it seems to me that you've taken a big step toward evaluative inarticulacy, because feelings of contentment are rather they're kind of one size fits all, whereas the evaluative language that we're in a position to inherit, if we really work at it, is rather rich. And so I don't know. This is just an example of a way in which a communicative technology can direct your communications it can nudge you in a particular direction. It's not that this is an ironclad requirement or anything like that, but I do think that these feedbacks of suggested refinements of our own speech from the communicative platform or technology itself are rather important and need to be enriched, right? This is just one little example, but there's so much to talk about under this heading, and I'm really not the person to talk about it with. I'm an ethical theorist who has a few things to say about the point of the humanities, and not a Silicon Valley programmer, right?
So I have kind of a follow-up question. I was intrigued when you were talking about how we're all Amish now because we're all very at ease, and it reminded me of something I read some time ago about, or someone said that the Amish were the most arguably advanced technologically in America, of Americans, because they really think about bringing in a new technology and how that's going to impact, as opposed to all of us, we just kind of willy-nilly adopt the newest technology. So would you agree with that? I think the argument the guy was trying to make, or the person was trying to make, was that technology is a subcategory of morality, really. It's not just this neutral thing, and that seems to be kind of along the
It
lines.
probably depends on the technology, but I've been focusing on communicative technologies, and it seems to me that they're crucial in shaping our, this is just, I think this is just to say the obvious, they're crucial in shaping our sense of selves, our sense of human connections, and, they're ripe for philosophical reflection, and that I would agree with. What I meant when I said that we're all Amish is just that we're in this weird moment in history where we're subject to what I would call an automatic form of proselytism, a proselytism without true believers, or that doesn't need true believers in order to go forward, because its communicative messages, which overlap on sort of a consumerist outlook on life, will be produced and produced well, even if no one thinks that they point the way to a good human life. And I think that that is historically unprecedented. And I also think there are two things to say about this sort of automatic proselytism. It doesn't depend upon true believers, and in the history of the planet, there's never been a more effective form of proselytism when it comes to getting its messages continually before the eyes of the population of the planet. That is historically weird, and it leaves us all in the position of being subjected to continuous exhortations to mold our souls in, to live in a way that I think most of us on reflection, and there's poll data that backs up this claim, find find really misguided, right? And so that's what I meant, right? And when I was commenting on Nussbaum, I think she views her neutralitarianism as a way of sort of sparing minority communities of that experience of being confronted with a majoritarian culture that is structuring the interactions that they can't separate themselves from in accordance with an alien picture of the human good. And I think that, ironically, that neutralitarianism ends up not sparing us from that kind of experience, but generalizing that kind of experience. That wouldn't happen at just any moment in human history, but that is a function of our background technological structures. And that's one example of why those structures are sort of ripe targets of philosophical reflection. Right?
You described very well initially the important role of the humanities and also developing a self-formative way, which we all applaud. I wanted to ask, though, how this relates. You were talking about the consumer culture. There are certain self-formative aspects of that culture as well, right? I would say as you encounter so many ads, and kids, they have to become very savvy about ads, very sort of educated in a very quick sense. As all those ads are also associated with social happiness, because ads realize it isn't the value of the product, but how it's somehow going to make you happy. And they can also get then a certain sense of what's been described as a cynical attitude, not a Socratic type of irony, but a hip sort of irony, whatever, it is what it is. And that can also go then not just towards the product, but maybe towards their overall living, the overall culture. I was wondering whether you have any thoughts as to how the humanities can address these sort of self-formative values as it's trying to develop these gift culture sort of values you're talking about, and the further values of paideia, Bildung, however we want to describe it.
Yeah, well, there's so much to say about that question. I hardly know where to begin, and I really appreciate what you said. I mean, how to do it, I wish I knew. You know, I just go to class and try to say something interesting, and then once in a while give a lecture, and I don't know what more to do. You know, but drawing attention to the problem seems, you know, important, right? You know, describing it in a way that really makes it vivid for the people who, you know, labor in it, because, you know, we tend not to see what's historically unique and interesting and maybe worth contesting about sort of our modes, our everyday modes of life and our everyday modes of interaction with others, our sense of what a word is for, right? But, you know, I do think that, I mean, I love teaching the Gorgias in the contemporary cultural climate, you know, for precisely the reason that you're putting a finger on, because, you know, that's, well, first of all, it's, you know, it's where the very idea of philosophy is being born, but it's also, you know, the whole argument is about what language is for, right? And it might seem like, well, there's no answer to that, but, well, I mean, and the word that I'm translating language here is a little more complicated than that. It's logos, right? And logos is, you know, it could be translated as reason. It could be, you know, translated as, you know, careful, illuminating thought. It could be translated as language, right? And, you know, and that faculty of linguistic reflection, by Socrates' lights, has a telos. It's got a proper place in a human life, and lives are misshapen unless it, you know, is called into, unless that the proper role of logos is actualized, right, and practiced in that life. And its proper role is really, I mean, you know, you could say all I did today was to, you know, rephrase Socrates' claims in the Gorgias, because, you know, he thinks that the proper place of logos in human life is to reflectively refine your sense of what you're up to in leading that life, right? And that's why this I mean, that's the self-formative use of logos, right? And it does seem to me that the cynicism that you're talking about, you know, is very hard to avoid in the contemporary communicative climate. But if it really bites deep, then one, it seems to me, doesn't have the kind of orientation toward spoken communication that's required in order to put logos to that use. I think that that's a very important use, right? And I don't think that, you know, I wouldn't put the problem this way. You know, we here in the academy appreciate the proper use of logos, right? And outside of the academy, there are lots of fallen souls or something like that. I don't think that for a second. I would say that the distrust of language and the ironic posture toward linguistic communication is rampant in our culture, and it can be a very valuable survival mechanism. You know, irony is just the posture to take toward a whole lot of what we're confronted with day to day when it comes to, you know, symbolic communication and speech. And yet, to the extent that it becomes, that it reshapes either the manipulative use of communication or ironic communication reshapes our practices within the academy, I think that that's, you know, really losing our way. But there's a lot to be said about how we've lost our way. And while I've thought here a little bit about what the humanities might be, it doesn't the description I've offered isn't one that, by my lights, perfectly coincides with what people do. Right?
Okay, so I think that's about all the time we have for questions. And speaking of material needs, we can address those now at the reception. But before we do that, just once again, let's thank our speakers.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's